Thank you for having me, first of all, and thanks to my great colleague Raisa, who's here to support me on some of the potential technical challenges I'd have otherwise of running polls and things. So I'm really happy to be here, and maybe to introduce myself first. Irish national, out of Ireland 10 years now, so I've been on the road. We've lived in 4 years in Belgium, then 3 years in France, and now the last 3 years in sunny Barcelona, so very happy to be here. I have 2 teenage daughters, so gender bias, I want them to grow up in a world that at least recognizes and that addresses, and I think we've made a big step forward, but just not enough. A wonderful husband who's very patient and puts up with all the women in the house. And I work for, as Sarah said, a company called DSM Firmenich. You may never have heard of us because we're B2B, but innovators in nutrition, health and beauty. And I can tell you, I never heard of us either before I started working there 3 years ago. But you probably have our products, you definitely have our products in your home. And some of the nicer ones, even if you know Gucci Flora, any Rituals products, Daisy by Marc Jacobs, we do all their smells, we create everything. So it's a really, really fun and exciting business. I'm going to share my screen and take you through a couple of slides. We're not going to kill you with PowerPoint this evening, but I've got a couple of supporting slides, also things that can maybe help bring the story to life a little bit better. Just to step back a little bit though, because you know I started my career, I dread to say 25 years ago, actually probably a little bit more, and I honestly didn't know such a thing existed. I grew up in a house where my mother and father both worked. My mother did do the housework actually, and nobody else did, because she had been brought up in a house where they had to do everything for the boys. She wanted to make sure that we didn't, but instead of making it equal, she did it for us all, which was probably not a good idea because we weren't great when we went to university, but okay. Then when I started work, I worked for a startup in telecoms. I worked in construction, so very male dominated, had a great time, loved my job. And the first time I worked in project management, so customer project management, basically at that point we were digging up the roads around Dublin and in Ireland and putting down fibre optic networks. And the first I understood of the whole concept of gender bias was when 2 new guys, so the company started to grow like crazy. We were responsible for customer project management, so we were connecting different customers, and these 2 guys got hired. And we discovered very quickly, my friend was very savvy, and she said to me, you know, they're being paid like, I don't know what it was, so many thousand more than us. So in fact, the next morning we marched into the boss's office and threatened him we were going to the newspapers. We were clearly in our early 20s and afraid of nothing. And told him we were going to go to the newspaper unless he sorted it out. And bizarrely enough, and this is the power that we had back in those days, he did. So we really moved on, and that was it. Then I worked for, that company got bought by an English company, British Telecom. And then I really understood really where gender bias comes from. Very traditional company, very male dominated, and not this generation. You know, Ireland was very neutral, I would say. Growing up, all my friends, male and female, we felt like the sky was the limit. We never really understood any of this idea of gender bias, but definitely experienced it there, and then moved to work for a French company. They sent me on a women in leadership week with 50 women, 25 nationalities in Istanbul, and I thought this was the worst idea in the world ever, because I just thought, oh my God, it's going to be so overwhelming with all of these women complaining. But actually it was amazing. It was really, really powerful. And then that's where I really started to understand the need for women to support women and to bring women up, because we are different. You know, the men and women, in the way that they network, in the way that they prepare, it's completely different. And not saying that these challenges and what we're going to talk about today don't also impact men, right? Let's be clear. In many cases they do, but not to the same level. And society is a little bit set up differently for many, many generations that we now have to change. Okay, I'll stop rabbiting on and just hopefully, oops, my screen is not. Okay, so what are we going to talk about today? We're going to look a little bit about what are the common challenges that leaders, and in particular women, can face. A little bit of food for thought, so some statistics and maybe a little call to action for you as startups and new entrepreneurs as you move on through your careers to remember. I hope you leave today with something to remember. A little bit about gender stereotyping. We're going to have a little poll there. We're going to talk a little bit very shortly on self-limiting beliefs and how they impact us. Then I'm going to share with you a program that's in our company, and it was created in Firmenich, the legacy. We're now DSM Firmenich, but a case study called A Step Forward, where they give some kind of ideas on how we overcome some of these challenges. And we're going to finish with my top 6 recommendations before a Q&A. So hopefully we will have some opportunity to have some interaction. And please, I won't be able to see if you raise your hand, but Right is on hand and can stop me. So if you have a question, if you want to share anything, should be a two-way street. So very happy to hear from you. So let's jump in. Common career challenges leaders can face. Okay, so the first one around the double bind of leadership. This is really, really interesting. So this is where, and it may come as a reaction to you sometimes when you see these things, you go, what do they mean by that? But then you go, okay, that makes sense. This is where we see strong, confident women can be considered competent, but not likable, while softer, more gentle and likable leaders, female leaders, can be seen as likable, but not competent. So they call it the likability bias. So if you're confident and assertive, you can be criticized for being too loud or speak too often. If you're quieter, you're told you need to speak up, you need to be more assertive. So really, really challenging one. Lack of sponsorship. Sponsorship, and this, as you start in your careers, as you start in your businesses, shouldn't be underestimated, should I say. The need to network, the need to build your tribe, the need to have supporters is really, really important. And men tend to be a little bit better at this than we do as women. So it's something you really need to work on. Different performance standards, again, not everywhere, but can often be the case where women feel they need or really do need to prove that they have the right skills. They say that women are hired on past performance while men are often hired on their potential future performance, which of course isn't fair. Paternal behavior. This is also another interesting one and something I really thought about because I experienced an example of this last week. It's where men protect, for good reasons, their female colleagues from something that they may be unpleasant because they don't want them to be upset. But actually, we can't learn if we're not exposed to the same challenges as men. Plus, that's also not fair. Assumptions about personal life is really probably the one that impacts women the most, right? Because this is where somebody is assuming that women, they're going to get pregnant and have babies, they're less committed to their career. We had a really good example from a top entrepreneur who said in one of her, before she set up on her own, and one of the reasons she set up on her own was she had a really big job in a bank. And her boss said to her one day, oh, but your husband has a great job and you're only doing this for fun. And she was like, hold on a minute, my husband doesn't even have a job. I'm the sole earner here. So that assumption can really impact how we progress. Imposter syndrome, we're going to talk a little bit more about in a while, but this is really that self-limiting beliefs where we feel we're not good enough, we don't belong, we don't deserve this job. I had another great example here where one of my best friends, who's probably one of the most intelligent people I know, was headhunted. And she came to me and she said, oh my God, she said, I'm not qualified for this job. And her husband laughed at her and he said, I haven't been qualified for any of the jobs I've gotten. That didn't stop me going for them. So we had a good giggle about it, but actually it's true. And I think Sarah said something at the beginning when we were setting up that, women, we feel like we have to prepare everything. We have to be fully ready. We're not generally, and again, I'm generalizing, but generally we're not so ready to wing it as men can be. Work-life balance is also a big topic and probably not such an issue for you today, but as you move on in your career, often I even find myself, we moved to Spain with my job. My husband has been supporting, as in kind of taking a step back role for the last period and helping bring up our children. But I'm still the one who books all the holidays, who sorts out all the banking, who does all of these extra things because I feel like he's not able for it. It's something that we have to let go a little bit and make sure that we do have that fair balance. They said, actually, McKinsey did a study during COVID, which said that men and women working at equal levels, still the woman was during COVID doing the bulk of the work with the children. And actually, that was a huge exodus from the market of women, that many of whom didn't come back after COVID because of that need. And finally, microaggressions. So this is where you may have experienced sometimes that a man has spoken over you or taking credit for your ideas, the concept of mansplaining, which I think I haven't experienced too much, thank God, but can be a bit challenging. So they're just some of the typical challenges that leaders can face. Then in terms of, what's the reality in terms of stats? Women have really moved on in the, let's say, from the 1900s, the 1970s and 1980s was massive progress. But in this century, how we can believe that it stalled completely in this century. Even post-COVID, we still haven't seen the return of what we saw in the 70s and 80s. So we really need to make a difference there. 98% of professional women experience at least one of the 7 most damaging power gaps that prevent individuals. I'm not going to read all this, right? But you can read it yourself. And 75% face 3 or more of these gaps. I'm going to tell you in a sec what those power gaps are. Another issue is limiting beliefs. So we're going to allude to those in a few minutes, but it's really, again, back to the kind of imposter syndrome, not good enough to perform on the job, don't have what it takes. Not, again, unique to women, but you'll see in the little survey we're going to look at in a few minutes that it's near top of the list of the challenges that women face. And one of the really surprising things that I hadn't thought about at all in the past is that the environment that has been dominated by men was set up, performance management systems, all of these things were set up for a time when men were the most part of the workforce, and haven't been addressed since. So this is where we put women in this double bind that we alluded to earlier. So before we talk about those 7 most damaging power gaps, we're going to have a little poll, right? So this is this guy Harry Chamberlain did this research into this whole area of gender stereotypes, and he said that many women in finance say that some of their main obstacles of progression relate to gender stereotypes. So what we were talking about a little bit ago, so needing to prove your value, not being taken seriously, being seen as aggressive when being assertive. Is this just in finance, or does it sound familiar? In what you know so far, of course, for some of you, this is the beginning of your careers, beginning of your startups, you might have had this experience. But let's have a little test and see. We've done a survey, so we're going to see if this matches. You can either, with your phones, go to menti.com and use the code there, or with your phones, take your camera and just use the QR code. Basically, a power gap is something that leaks your confidence, something that leaks your vision for the future and your authority. And I've completely forgotten the name of the lady who discovered it, but it'll be in the shared material after this call. And she discovered it in a study she was doing to understand why senior women who were like super, super confident had this like self-doubt and low confidence. And what she said was the 7 gaps, and again, remembering that they're not just for women, but women tend to display at least 3 of them at the one time. First one would be not recognizing special talents and abilities and accomplishments. I used to think this was an Irish humbleness, but then I realized my Irish colleagues didn't have it as well. So it can be like, again, back to this imposter syndrome. So inability to believe that you deserve the success. So you often think that it's because of good luck. It's not really because I'm so brilliant that I am where I am. Second one is similar, but a different in the sense communicating from fear, not strength. What does that mean? That's really about, again, back to this fear of bragging, so unable to communicate your real accomplishments because you might be seen as, oh, who does she think she is? And don't want to take too much credit. So missing that assertiveness or feeling that people will judge them if they take too much credit for it. So that's around the communication. Another one, and it's going to come up a little bit later in my tips, is a reluctance to ask for what you deserve. So 57% of men negotiate their first salary. 7% of women. So really inequality from the start. So, you know, I'm starting a job, I'm offered whatever, I accept it. 57% of men will negotiate that number. Super interesting. Isolating themselves. I mentioned a little bit earlier about network and building your network. So find networking fake or uncomfortable. Generally, women are more comfortable with making connections, building relationships. Men are quite comfortable with going and playing a game of golf or a game of football, but not actually knowing the name of the guy they played with by the end of it. So really, that whole networking can be a bit more challenging for us. The fifth one is not an inability, but not saying stop. So silent in the face of unfair. So can be personally something that happens to you that you don't think is fair, but you don't say stop, this is not acceptable. Or also, it's also about supporting others. So seeing something, not liking it, but not doing anything about it. The sixth one is also interesting and comes back to some of those challenges, which is losing sight of your dreams. So sometimes you focus too much on what you don't want and you lose sight of what you do want. So really keeping that focus on what is my North Star, where do I want to be, where do I want to go? And then finally, and one that's really, really important, is allowing past trauma or drama to define you. So it could be a previous manager, it could be a bad experience, it could be something that you really need to pick up, learn, move on. Sometimes we wallow in it and don't allow ourselves to move on from there. So really, it's about having that energy, confidence, influence, and commitment also with other women. So that's a little bit about those 7 gaps. Raisa, how are we doing? Do we have some answers?
Yes, we have some answers. I'm just sending in the chat the ones that we have.
Okay, great.
Can you see it, or do you want me to go through it?
If you can just go through it, I'm going to be interested to see how it matches our survey.
Yes. So 40% said that, yes, I have experience and continue to do so. Okay, so it's the blue one.
Yeah.
Other 40% said that sometimes, but it has not really impacted my career. And the other 20 is no, it's not something that I have experienced until now.
Wow. So not so far away from the survey that I did 2 years ago on this topic. So this was, and the 45 people that I surveyed were colleagues. In fact, Raisa probably completed it herself. Friends, both male and by the way, both, I did another one on male and female. This was just female, but university colleagues, young people at the start of their career, people at the end of their career, and super, super interesting. So you can see some of the comments there. I'm not going to read them all out, but you can see mainly due to having to prove their value continuously, mansplaining, just what I mentioned there. So very, very interesting, but maybe not impacted their career. Sharing a suggestion not acknowledged, but then a male colleague said the same. Comments not heard. So really, there's such a common pattern here that we can't ignore it. This one I think is me. I think probably I would have written this one if I'd answered the survey. So I found that could be perceived to be rude or aggressive. You know, I've been told in the past that I'm a bit too direct, but it hasn't held me back in the long run. So thank you for that, and thanks for giving us that feedback. So let's move on and see what else we have to share. So I mentioned a little bit earlier the idea of these self-limiting beliefs impacting our performance. Again, it's focused on this I'm not good enough, I'll never be successful, I don't have enough experience, I'm not smart enough, I'll never be a great leader. And what really the crux of this is probably everybody at some point has these self-limiting beliefs. So the real challenge is, how do we overcome them? You know, how do we get to the point that we can turn them into something positive, that we can realize and pat ourselves on the back, right? Just because they're there for a reason. If you look at the text there, they're caused by our brain's desire to protect us from pain in the future. So they're like a defense mechanism. I know that I was the typical student in school who I did an exam and I'd say, oh no, that was terrible. And then I actually did fine. But I think I thought it was terrible, but in fact, a lot of the time I believed that it was my own internal defense mechanism helping me in case I did wrong, then I wouldn't be so disappointed. But the triggers for the self-limiting beliefs can be fear, it can be imposter syndrome, can be past experiences. So really this is all about recognizing, because maybe that you're in that great 20% that haven't experienced any of this, and I hope you don't. But you might see it with others. And so it's really, really good that you can be there to support your friends, your colleagues, and in future your employees, because that's what it's all about, is really making sure this whole circle is followed. Now, this is all the, let's say, challenges, all the, you know, I don't want to say negative stuff, but it can seem all a bit negative. So what are the positives? This is a program that Fairmanage, now DSM Fairmanage, started about 2 years ago. And I discovered this when I was asked to speak at a conference for women in leadership. And I asked our DEI colleagues for some materials, and they shared this with me, and I was really, really impressed with it. And they have behind it a whole program, which is something that, at least in the last number of years, it's really become an agenda topic, and hopefully it will remain to be so. So this was their tips. I'm going to share with you their tips, and then I'm going to share with you my tips. And then let's see what you take, what resonates from this and what you take from it. And then we can have hopefully a bit of dialogue. So be unapologetically yourself. Maybe easy to say, maybe not so easy to apply, but really, if we can be who we are and be ourselves, then that's really important. Prioritizing you, also really important, and really that, I think, it speaks for itself in terms of what it says. You don't succeed alone. So I think this is, you know, there's no all of these typical. There's no I in team. You've got to have networking. You've got to have relationship. Ask for somebody to mentor you. You know, I have not even necessarily a mentor, but I have one of my best friends these days is a lady that I met at a conference many years ago. And then we discovered that our daughters were in the same school that was in Brussels. Then they moved, then we moved. I'm actually going on holidays with her in 3 weeks in Italy. But we still have probably once every 3 months a connect to talk about how we're doing, to talk about specifically around work. So we, you know, a lot of the time it was, when we lived in Brussels, it ended up drinking coffee or even drinking wine in the evening. But it's really if either of us are changing jobs, I changed jobs, and since she decided 3 months later, okay, I'm ready too, I'm going, really help each other and rely on each other and give each other advice. So really that kind of mentorship, that kind of support network is really, really important, because we really we need to help others, and we also need to be helped. Perfect doesn't exist. I know we like to think it does, but I had also the luck when I worked at a company called Schneider Electric, and I had this particular program where they gave us access to the board of directors, and one of the board of directors said to me that I've always kept with me. You know, we strive to get 80% of the data before we make a decision, and 100% of the data before we make a decision, when the reality is we're never going to get 100%. So if you can accept that 80% is good enough, or even 75 sometimes, you're going to be much more successful. Being emotional. So sometimes people feel that emotions or showing your emotions is showing weakness. Definitely not. And I think really this whole concept of being your authentic self, being unapologetically yourself, is related to the same. We're all human. We all feel, have bad days, good days, get upset by things, are more sensitive sometimes. So it's really important that people see that in you, and that people feel that you're really that you're in touch, and that you are that human person. I've forgotten the type of there's a name for leadership. These leaders now, and I've completely forgotten the name, but it'll come back to me before the end of our session. Follow your gut. I sometimes follow my gut a little bit too much. In my career, I've made some quite rash decisions. They've always worked out in the end, thank God. They've been touch and go, but really trust your gut, because generally it's right. Choose your own path. You own your career. You own your destiny. Don't let anyone else choose it for you. This is really, really important. I've made one decision where I took the wrong one because of a lot of advice that way, or a lot of push that way. Luckily enough, I moved out of there soon enough. Be courageous. Be courageous. Raise your hand. I tell this to my daughters all the time. Don't be afraid to say something wrong. Don't be afraid to. There's no stupid questions. Do not tolerate discrimination. That's really. Be kind. That's so important. And finally, we are not superheroes. So learning to ask and accept help from anyone is essential. Take vacation and get enough sleep, right? I think that's pretty practical advice as well. So these are, let's say, what came from the Step Forward program. So what am I going to tell you that's different? So in my experience, I've got a couple that I think have worked for me. So also mentioned there about asking for something. So remembering my gender pay story, where we went in and demanded I'm not sure it would work so well these days, certainly not in DSM Firmenich, but we often don't ask for things that are even not so big. And if you don't ask, I actually had a situation, I was lucky enough last year to be given some coaching hours. And with my coach, she was like, why are you accepting that? Why didn't you ask? And it was to my boss of the time. And I asked, and he said, yeah. And I was like, oh my God, why didn't I ask that 6 months ago? So I think it's quite interesting. And it's a typical, sadly, thing that women are not as good at, is asking. It was mentioned earlier about don't let the past define you, learn and move on, which for me is own it, fix it, move on. I had this amazing boss many years ago. I had a disastrous project that went really, really wrong. And he was super kind to me. He was trying to reassure me that everything was okay, but it was a disaster. But what he said was, people don't remember what went wrong. They remember how you reacted to it. And I can tell you, I reacted by working 24/7 for a week or two to solve it. But in the end, looking back on that, nobody did remember. So this was super interesting as well, that 81% of women say that they put more pressure, or that they believe they put more pressure on themselves not to fail. We can fail. There's nothing wrong with failure, as long as you learn from it. So the next one that I think personally, and my youngest daughter has the same problem as me, so I think it's quite genetic, try to ignore negative feedback. So only accept constructive. I say to my daughter, haters gonna hate. Put your energy into being authentic. You don't need to keep proving yourself, just show up. And if that's not good enough, then you're talking to the wrong people. I mentioned it, I can't say it enough. Build your team of promoters, both male and female. Insist on coaching. Look for a mentor. Connect with colleagues. Look for people you respect. I mentioned my friend Eliana, who was a key person. Another friend of mine who worked in HR, another key person that I always rely on, and she relies on me. So it's a two-way street. 72% of women look for mentors and trusted colleagues. So it's something that's quite natural for us, but maybe we're not always looking for the right people or looking for enough. Another one that's really one of the most important is to support others. Give your time. We're all overworked, but make your time to help others, because and don't tolerate bad behavior in others, either male or female, because it's not just a male, as I keep mentioning, this is not just a male thing, and I've seen female leaders that have been really not acceptable in my mind. This one isn't mine, but I definitely think that it can work for some people, is really this idea of the self-limiting beliefs. Write them down, understand why they are bothering you, find that negative voice that's in there and take micro steps. Write down what are the small things that you can do to change it. So just to finish on that, diversity and inclusion are on every agenda. So really, we need to move the bar, and we need to work on these topics. I had an ex-colleague, a male ex-colleague, because when I did this research a couple of years ago, I reached out to men and women. It wasn't just because I think it's super important that we're all aware of this challenge in the workplace. And he told me that we still have, I've written this down, so I'm going to read it out. We still have a very limited view of our pond. The ocean out there needs a lot more cleaning. And we have a long way to go before we have parity. But what made me laugh is his son, who was 15, was like, God, Dad, just stop talking about it and do it. So his son told him that the skill should be the only differentiator. So, I think that was quite, coming from a 15-year-old was pretty impressive. So finally, we're going to just go to, I hope that has been in some way useful to you in terms of what I'm sharing so far. I want to stop for a minute and see if there's any of these concepts. What of all of these words you've heard, or you could just say it's all rubbish. That can be a word that goes into the Mentimeter. You've got the Mentimeter again. You've got the code. So tell us a word or a sentence or anything that what's the word? Not inspired, that impressed you or impacted you from what you've heard so far today, and then hopefully we can have a short dialogue before we finish. Good. So see some of the concepts that are staying out. So trust your gut. I have a voice. Be confident. Yes, I can. I love it. Double bind of leadership. Self-limiting beliefs. Ask questions. Super. Okay, so we're going to share this with you afterwards. If you have any other concepts that have stayed with you, then we can go with that. But I'm going to start sharing my screen again.
Thank you so much, Angela, for sharing. I always like these sessions. I always like hearing the stories, and I think, as I said, it will always be useful to have this in mind for people who start companies and that will be responsible for the culture in the company. And even if you don't start a company, hopefully one day, you'll be manager, you'll be hiring people, or you'll just be working with people and just be mindful of, how to include people in conversations, watch out for who talks more in meetings and who doesn't, and try to address why that is. So thank you so much, Angela. Thank you, Raisa, as well, for helping out.